The ancient priest's curse was absolute, woven into the very marrow of the realm. The exact terms declared by Priest Caspian were a death sentence wrapped in holy vengeance. The very next woman the Alpha King touched skin to skin would become his fated wife, bound to share his immense, monstrous power or suffer a devastating magical collapse. For an entire year, he had kept his hands heavily sealed within the gilded gloves, his physical distance from the world absolute and uncompromising. The high winter banquet was supposed to be a quiet display of the crown's untouchable strength. Instead, it became the moment Maeve Thorne's entire world shattered. The onyx palace of Thornmere was a fortress carved entirely from shadows, obsidian stone, and eternal ice. Maeve knelt on the freezing expanse of the grand banquet hall, her bruised knees pressing painfully into the unforgiving black marble. She dragged a coarse, bristle-haired brush across the stone in slow, methodical circles. The biting winter draught slipped beneath the heavy iron-wrought doors at the far end of the cavernous corridor, cutting straight through her thin, frayed cotton uniform. She ignored the violent shivering of her own limbs, leaning harder into the brush. Survival in the Alpha King's royal court required a terrifying kind of invisibility. A girl who kept her head bowed and her mouth shut could not be accused of treason. A girl who was never truly seen could not become a target for the vicious, plotting nobles who circled the throne like starving vultures. Her hands were raw, the skin severely chapped and stinging from the harsh, acidic lye soap she used to scrub the endless floors. The sharp, abrasive scent of chemical cleaner mixed heavily with the underlying aroma of damp pine and old wood smoke that always permeated the lower levels of the keep. Maeve dipped her brush into the wooden bucket beside her. The water was near freezing, filled with tiny floating shards of ice that bit into her skin like broken glass. She did not complain. She did not beg for mercy from the harsh elements. She did not stop. She only focused on the repetitive numbing friction of the bristles against the stone, willing the hollow, aching emptiness in her chest to stay quiet. There was a dormant, unexplainable warmth buried deep within her blood, a strange, thrumming celestial energy she had spent her entire life hiding, but today the bitter winter cold was winning. "Keep your head down, little bird," a hushed voice murmured from the deep shadows of a nearby towering pillar. Eldra Finch, the aging head maid of the royal wing, stepped into the dim, ambient light of the flickering wall sconces. Her sharp, highly observant eyes continuously scanned the perimeter of the cavernous hall, carefully tracking the distant movements of the armed palace guards. Eldra possessed the quiet, battered wisdom of a woman who had survived 3 different violent regimes in Thornmere. She carried a thick stack of fresh linen towels, her steps completely silent on the polished stone. She knew the deadly dangers of this court better than anyone, and she had taken Maeve under her protective wing since the fragile girl had first arrived at the keep. "The court is extraordinarily restless today," Eldra whispered, coming to a halt beside Maeve's wooden bucket. She pressed a dry, relatively warm towel into Maeve's trembling shoulder, offering a rare physical anchor of comfort in a deeply hostile world. "The Northern Lords have arrived in full force to demand an audience. Duchess Giselle is standing right there with them. They are going to push the marriage treaties again. They want to test the absolute boundaries of Priest Caspian's curse." Maeve paused, her scrubbing, her breath pluming in the frigid, oppressive air. The mere mention of the ancient priest's name sent a violent, somatic ripple of dread racing down her spine. A year ago, Priest Caspian had stood before the high altar, his voice echoing with terrible, ancient magic as he punished the Alpha King for his ruthless military conquests. The priest had weaponized Arthur Pendragon's greatest physical asset, turning his very touch into a lethal snare. The decree was permanently woven into the ancient blood of the earth itself. The first woman the king touched would instantly become his bound mate. If she possessed a weak, mortal vessel, the sheer catastrophic force of his raw alpha magic would shatter her spirit from the inside out. "They cannot force a marriage treaty," Maeve murmured softly, wringing out her heavy brush with stiff, clumsy fingers. "The king has not removed the gilded gloves since the exact day the curse was cast. He doesn't allow a single living soul within 3 paces of his shadow. He would never intentionally risk innocent lives just to satisfy the ruthless ambitions of the High Court." "Duchess Giselle does not care about the king's careful precautions," Eldra warned, her voice dropping to a brittle, terrified thread of sound. "She is wearing a gown of crimson silk tonight, and she has deliberately filled the high table with her own vicious loyalists. She arrogantly believes her pureblood wolf is strong enough to survive the brutal physical transfer of the curse. She wants to stage an accidental collision. A brush of the hand, a stumble in the crowded hallway. If she can force the mate bond to activate, she automatically becomes Queen of Thornmere by divine right, and not even the king can legally deny her claim." Before Maeve could formulate a response, the massive oak and iron doors at the front of the grand hall groaned in violent protest. The heavy, booming sound echoed off the vaulted ceilings, vibrating straight through the black marble and settling deep into the marrow of Maeve's aching bones. The temperature in the massive room plummeted instantly. The flickering orange flames in the heavy iron wall sconces flared a brilliant, unnatural blue, fighting a losing battle against the sudden, overwhelming pressure that flooded the space. It was a terrifying physical weight, an alpha aura so dense and suffocating that it felt like a hurricane chained inside a glass jar. Arthur Pendragon had arrived. Maeve immediately dropped her gaze to the floor, her heart kicking frantically against her ribs. Her peripheral vision filled with the trailing hem of his heavy, midnight black cloak sweeping across the smooth stone. The terrifying, rhythmic cadence of his steel-toed boots echoed loudly as he moved relentlessly toward the raised royal dais. He walked with a rigid, highly unnatural stiffness, his immensely broad shoulders locked in a permanent state of brutal, agonizing restraint. He was a man built entirely for war, a creature of absolute, devastating power, yet he moved through his own magnificent palace like a condemned prisoner stepping blindly through a minefield. Every single noble in the cavernous hall fell completely silent. The ambient, plotting chatter of the visiting lords vanished instantly, replaced by the collective, held breath of the terrified court. The sheer, unadulterated dominance radiating from the Alpha King was easily enough to bow the stubborn heads of even the most arrogant, pure-blood alphas. As Arthur passed within a mere few yards of Maeve's kneeling form, she caught the distinct, intoxicating scent of crushed cedar, bitter winter frost, and raw, ozone-heavy magic. Her wide eyes flicked upward for a fraction of a microscopic second, landing entirely on his massive hands. The gilded gloves, they were thick, formidable barriers crafted from the scarred, indestructible hide of a mountain drake, laced tightly with glowing golden threads that hummed with punishing suppression runes. The enchanted leather encased his hands and muscular forearms completely, disappearing seamlessly beneath the dark cuffs of his royal tunic. They were a physical, suffocating barrier between his lethal, cursed soul and the fragile world around him. He wore the gilded gloves at all times, without exception. He wore them to sign peace treaties, to eat his meals, to sleep in his lonely bed, and to command his vast armies. The sheer isolation rolling off his massive frame was palpable, an agonizing, quiet despair that tugged strangely at the hidden, dormant warmth buried deep in Maeve's chest. "Get up!" Eldra hissed suddenly, snapping Maeve out of her highly dangerous observation. The frantic head maid hauled Maeve up to her aching feet, shoving a massive, empty silver serving tray into her raw, blistered hands. The king is taking his designated seat at the dais. The Duchess and her entourage have strategically abandoned the lower tables to crowd the front steps. Go clear their discarded glasses before the royal address officially begins. Move quickly, Maeve. Do not linger near the obsidian throne. Maeve swallowed hard, her dry throat painfully tight. She nodded once in silent obedience, wrapping her aching, numb fingers securely around the ornate edges of the heavy silver tray. The slow walk toward the front of the cavernous hall felt exactly like wading through incredibly deep, freezing water. The sheer concentration of elite, predatory wolves gathered near the dais made the air thick and almost impossible to breathe. Duchess Giselle stood proudly near the front steps, her exquisite crimson silk gown pooling on the dark floor like freshly spilled blood. The ambitious noblewoman was laughing softly at something a nearby courtier had said, her sweet, heavily practiced smile completely contradicting the toxic, coldly calculating gleam in her predatory eyes. Maeve kept her head tucked low, her rigid posture radiating absolute unquestionable submission as she approached the abandoned wooden dining tables, positioned just below the royal dais. She began meticulously loading the heavy silver tray. First, she stacked the discarded silver dining plates, which were heavily slick with roasted meat grease. Then, she carefully gathered the tall, fragile crystal goblets, many of which were still half full of sticky, dark, honeyed wine. The combined weight of the tray increased rapidly, severely straining the weakened, exhausted muscles of Maeve's slender forearms. She gritted her teeth against the sharp burn, adjusting her precarious grip. The black marble floor in this specific section of the hall was incredibly treacherous. The visiting northern nobles had carelessly tracked in thick layers of winter slush from the courtyard, which had now melted into slick, invisible puddles of freezing water dangerously mixed with careless spills of dark wine. Just 10 feet away, seated heavily upon the massive obsidian throne, Arthur Pendragon shifted his immense weight in obvious discomfort. The heavy leather of the gilded gloves groaned aloud, pulling painfully taut against his scarred knuckles. The magical suppression runes woven deeply into the ancient hide were actively suffocating him, burning his skin with a constant, low-grade magical fever specifically designed to keep his raging alpha power fully contained. The sheer physical toll of the ancient priest's curse was absolute, constantly warring against his immense natural strength and driving him toward the very edge of madness. Maeve lifted the fully loaded tray with a soft grunt, her biceps trembling violently under the immense weight of the stacked crystal and silver. She took a slow, highly calculated step backward, intending to pivot smoothly and disappear back into the warm safety of the servant corridors. She desperately needed to escape the crushing proximity of the royal court before her dormant celestial magic reacted to the king's overwhelming aura. On the elevated dais, Arthur grimaced sharply. A jagged, broken piece of the internal leather binding had just snapped, digging violently into the tender flesh of his right wrist. The sharp, stinging pain was a sudden, blinding distraction from the endless political drone of the lords presenting their greedy cases. Unable to tolerate the biting metal clasp for another second, the Alpha King raised his left hand and quickly, forcefully, yanked the right side of the gilded gloves loose. He intended to adjust the cruel clasp and replace the heavy leather within 2 mere seconds. He only desperately needed a momentary breath of cool winter air against his fevered, heavily scarred skin. Below the dais, Maeve took her second careful step backward. Her worn, completely smooth-soled shoe came down directly on a hidden patch of half-frozen slush and spilled honeyed wine. There was absolutely no traction. There was only a sudden, terrifying absence of physical friction. The devastating slip happened in agonizingly slow motion. Maeve felt her entire center of gravity vanish entirely. Her leading foot shot violently forward, and the heavy silver tray tipped drastically backward. The precarious, towering stack of crystal goblets shifted uncontrollably. Glass collided with glass, emitting a sharp, ringing chime of impending disaster just before the entire tray spilled over the edge. The heavy silver crashed brutally against the unforgiving marble. crystal shattered into 1,000 glittering, deadly pieces, the tremendous sound exploding like a physical bomb in the dead, tense silence of the royal court. Maeve pitched forward helplessly, falling directly toward the sharp stone steps of the royal dais. She threw out her bare arms, desperately trying to brace herself against the jagged shards of broken glass covering the slick floor. The violent sound of the shattering crystal instantly triggered every lethal, protective instinct hidden deep within Arthur Pendragon's blood. He did not think of his terrible curse. He did not think of the countless political traps surrounding him. His massive inner wolf only saw a fragile, vulnerable member of his pack falling toward a dangerous field of broken glass, and his powerful body moved with supernatural, blinding speed to intercept the immediate danger. He lunged off the obsidian throne, descending the stone steps in a terrifying blur of dark fabric and raw, uncontainable power. He reached out to catch the falling girl by her fragile shoulder, completely forgetting that his right hand was currently bare. Maeve braced tightly for the agonizing, bloody impact of the marble floor. Instead, she collided violently with a wall of solid, unyielding heat and hardened muscle. Her exposed collarbone crashed directly into the Alpha King's bare, heavily scarred palm. Skin met skin. For one microscopic fraction of a heartbeat, the entire universe seemed to stop breathing. Then, the ancient, devastating curse detonated. It was not a mere spark. It was a catastrophic elemental explosion of pure, unadulterated magic. A blinding, searing flash of molten golden light erupted violently from the exact point where Arthur's bare fingers gripped Maeve's collarbone. The tremendous shockwave of power blasted outward in a perfect circle, shattering the remaining intact stained glass windows of the grand hall and violently knocking the closest ambitious nobles right off their feet. Maeve let out a ragged, completely breathless gasp as the bond snapped shut. The intense heat flooding into her frail body was entirely incomprehensible. It was a liquid, roaring fire burning rapidly through her veins, aggressively overriding the bitter winter cold that had lived stubbornly in her bones for years. The sheer, overwhelming force of the Alpha King's ancient soul was violently forcing its way into her own, demanding absolute submission, demanding a worthy vessel to hold its endless, crushing weight. The bitter winter chill that had haunted her for 19 years evaporated instantly. It was replaced by a roaring, honeyed warmth that smelled of pine needles, rain, and raw masculine protection. For the first time in her life, Maeve did not feel cold. She felt completely, overwhelmingly anchored. The sheer cosmic magnitude of the bond wrapped around her soul like a heavy, indestructible blanket. The hollow mark doesn't just contain your power, it creates a void, an absence where your magic should be. Priest Caspian's ancient warning echoed flawlessly in Maeve's panicked mind as the alpha magic rushed beneath her skin like a tidal wave. Beneath Arthur's bare hand, the fragile skin of Maeve's collarbone flared with overwhelming, blinding heat. But instead of instantly destroying her frail human body, the violent intrusion of the king's curse met a sudden, impossible resistance. The deeply buried, long dormant celestial warmth inside Maeve's chest rose up furiously like a waking dragon. It surged upward to meet the king's aggressive magic, miraculously intertwining with the lethal curse and transmuting the destructive dark power into a blazing, brilliant light. The brand seared itself permanently and beautifully into her flesh. The solar seal. It was a sprawling, intricate crest of celestial suns and ancient wolf runes, glowing fiercely with a molten golden luminescence that shone visibly through the frayed, damp collar of her servant's dress. Arthur gasped sharply, his storm-grey eyes widening in absolute, paralyzing horror. The somatic physical feedback of the sudden mate bond slammed into his broad chest like a brutal physical blow. He felt her sheer terror, he felt her bone-deep exhaustion, and he felt the undeniable, terrifying truth settling heavily into his soul. The ancient magic had anchored successfully. The fated tether was permanently forged in unbreakable, cosmic iron. He dropped heavily to his knees, right there on the glass-strewn marble, his bare hand still locked desperately against her glowing collarbone, completely unable to let go even if he tried. His massive, terrifying frame trembled uncontrollably, bowing low before the absolute lowest-ranking member of his entire household. The ferocious Alpha King, the ruthless commander of 10,000 wolves, was weeping silent, agonizing tears of absolute surrender. Around them, the royal court of Thornmere descended into absolute, stunned silence. Duchess Giselle stood frozen, just a few feet away, her exquisite crimson silk gown heavily speckled with drops of spilled wine, her jaw unhinged in complete, catastrophic disbelief. The discarded heavy leather of the gilded gloves lay forgotten on the wet stone. The Alpha King was breathing heavily, his broad chest heaving dramatically as he stared down in total awe at the trembling, low-status serving girl, currently radiating brilliant golden light onto his dark palace floor. He had spent an entire grueling year building an impenetrable, lonely fortress to protect himself from the cruel world. No woman lasted a night with him, they had whispered in the dark. But one woman did. One woman lasted a lifetime, because ultimate destiny had just bypassed his formidable walls entirely, and the ancient curse had finally found its rightful queen. The blinding luminescence of the solar seal began to settle, retracting from the shattered stained glass windows and absorbing deeply into the fragile skin of Maeve Thorne's collarbone. The grand banquet hall of the Onyx Palace remained trapped in suffocating silence. The scent of ozone, melted winter slush, and spilled honeyed wine hung heavily in the frigid air, sharply contrasting with the lingering chemical bite of the lye soap-coating Maeve's blistered hands. Arthur Pendragon, the most feared sovereign in the Northern Territories, remained on his knees among the treacherous shards of broken crystal. His broad, heavily scarred chest heaved with ragged, unsteady breaths. He did not glance at the stunned nobles surrounding them in the cavernous hall. He did not watch his heavily armored royal guards. His piercing gaze was locked entirely on the trembling, wide-eyed serving girl trapped beneath his massive, bare right hand. The ancient mate bond was a living, breathing entity. It pulsed violently between them, an undeniable, rhythmic thrumming that bypassed the physical world entirely. Through the direct skin-to-skin contact, Maeve felt the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the Alpha King's chaotic power slamming into her fragile frame like a physical blow. A sudden, catastrophic weight rushed through the newly formed tether, an unstoppable avalanche of dark, lethal magic belonging to Priest Caspian's curse. It actively attempted to hollow out her mortal soul, carrying the freezing, necrotic winter frost designed to shatter any ordinary human vessel. She gasped, her blistered fingers twitching wildly against the cold marble as she braced for her fragile blood vessels to blacken and burst beneath her pale skin. Instead, as the icy torrent hit her, she felt the bond anchor deep within her chest, completely absorbing the lethal shock without a single fracture. Through her blurred vision, Maeve stared up at Arthur's face. She watched the absolute horror twisting his sharp features. Those turbulent irises were frantic, tracking her every shallow breath as if he fully expected her to scream in agonizing pain, as if he believed she was about to freeze and shatter into a million bloody pieces right beneath his bare hand. Instead, the golden brand simply radiated a profound, sunlit warmth, stubbornly fighting back against the devastating chill of his alpha aura. It was a gentle, soothing heat that settled over her malnourished bones like a heavy, protective winter quilt, chasing away the bitter frost of the shadowy fortress. The unnatural silence of the court finally shattered, broken by a sound that made Maeve's stomach twist in familiar terror. "Get away from her!" Duchess Giselle shrieked, the ugly, shrill sound slicing through the tense atmosphere like a rusted blade. The ambitious, pure-blood noblewoman stepped forward, her sweet, practiced facade completely dissolving into a mask of pure venom. Her exquisite crimson silk gown, dragged through puddles of dark wine and shattered crystal as she pointed a trembling, accusing finger at the fallen maid. She orchestrated this. The filthy little rat deliberately threw herself at the crown. She is an assassin sent by the southern rebel factions to trigger the curse and destroy the king. The surrounding lords began to murmur frantically, their voices rising in a chaotic crescendo of panic and outrage. The heavy, aggressive scent of pack politics and impending violence flooded the cavernous hall, suffocating the delicate warmth radiating from Maeve's collarbone. Several of Giselle's loyalist guards instinctively reached for the heavy iron hilts of their broadswords, stepping cautiously toward the royal dais. They sought to exploit the sovereign's perceived moment of vulnerability, wanting to eliminate the low-status intruder before the ancient bond could fully stabilize and bind their king to a commoner. Maeve whimpered softly, shrinking back against the icy marble as she heard the subtle metallic scrape of a drawn blade echoing off the vaulted stone ceilings. The transition was instantaneous. The weeping, terrified man kneeling above her vanished, instantly replaced by the ruthless, feral commander of 10,000 wolves. Arthur's striking pale eyes shifted rapidly, bleeding into a burning molten gold that illuminated the harsh angles of his scarred face. A low, animalistic growl ripped through his broad chest, a sound so impossibly deep and violently aggressive that the black marble floor physically vibrated beneath Maeve's back. It was the pure, unfiltered voice of his inner beast, demanding absolute, unquestionable submission from every living creature in the room. The advancing guards froze instantly, the color draining entirely from their arrogant faces. The immense, suffocating pressure of his alpha aura slammed down upon the hall like a falling mountain. Maeve felt the sheer weight of his dominance, pushing the oxygen out of the vast room. Though the crushing force miraculously curved around her own fragile body, leaving her completely untouched by his wrath. Several weaker nobles simply collapsed to their knees on the wet stone, clutching their throats and gasping for breath as the air grew dangerously thin. Arthur did not bother to issue a verbal command. He simply withdrew his bare hand from Maeve's collarbone, a motion that caused a sharp, agonizing pull behind both of their ribs, and swiftly gathered her fragile body into his massive arms. He scooped her up from the treacherous floor with supernatural gentleness, entirely ignoring the jagged pieces of broken crystal that dug fiercely into the dark fabric of his trousers. He pulled her tightly against his broad chest, instantly wrapping the heavy, midnight black folds of his royal cloak around her shivering frame to shield her from the hostile, predatory gazes of the court. The sheer physical contrast between them was staggering. Maeve felt incredibly small, completely engulfed in the raw, towering heat of his muscular physique. The intoxicating scent of crushed cedar, ancient leather, and winter frost surrounded her, entirely overriding the sharp, chemical stench of the lye soap she had been using all morning. If a single soul in this room takes one step toward this girl, Arthur's voice boomed, echoing off the ancient stone walls with the lethal cutting edge of a drawn sword. I will personally burn their ancestral lands to ash and salt the earth with their bones. He did not wait for a single whispered response. The king turned his back on the stunned, terrified court and strode rapidly toward the heavily fortified iron doors leading to the private royal wing. His steel-toed boots struck the floor with a rhythmic, unyielding cadence that vibrated through Maeve's aching bones. He held his mate with a desperate, terrifying tightness, his powerful arms locked around her, as if he believed the very shadows of the black stronghold were actively trying to rip her away from him. Maeve kept her face buried deeply in the heavy wool of his tunic, her heart kicking frantically against her ribs like a trapped bird. The somatic feedback of the newly formed bond was overwhelming, flooding her senses with every step he took. Every time Arthur's heart beat, a sympathetic, molten pulse throbbed directly over her collarbone, a burning reminder that she was no longer an invisible, disposable servant. The crushing, terrifying reality of the situation began to set in. She had just triggered the most dangerous curse in the history of the Great Divide, and there was no hiding in the shadows anymore. The endless, cavernous corridors of the palace blurred past them in a dizzying rush of dark stone, towering marble pillars and flickering torchlight. Arthur bypassed the heavily armed sentinel guards without a single word, kicking open the massive oak doors of his private sanctuary with a resounding crash that rattled the heavy iron hinges. The royal chambers were a vast, heavily warded fortress hidden deep within the impenetrable heart of the keep. Unlike the bitter, freezing hostility of the lower halls, this room was incredibly warm and fiercely guarded against the outside world. A massive, roaring fire crackled fiercely within an enormous black stone hearth, casting dancing, ambient orange light across the rich obsidian floors and the heavy blood-red velvet draperies. It was a space designed for a lonely, untouchable monarch, rich in texture but utterly devoid of any human company. Arthur moved straight toward the center of the expansive room and gently laid Maeve down upon the massive, velvet-draped mattress. The bedding was unbelievably soft, a luxurious cloud of pristine white silk and heavy, imported furs that instantly swallowed her exhausted, aching limbs. But the very moment his scarred hands left her body, the sudden absence of physical touch sent a sharp, agonizing jolt of cold panic straight through the newly formed, fated tether. Maeve watched breathlessly as Arthur stumbled backward away from the bed, his broad shoulders heaving violently as he stared at his own bare right hand in absolute horror. The glowing brand on Maeve's collarbone was actively illuminating the dim space around her, casting a soft, celestial glow against the dark velvet pillows and reflecting in the king's wide, panicked eyes. "What have I done?" he whispered, his voice cracking with a raw, devastating despair that completely shattered his terrifying public persona. He dragged his trembling fingers through his dark, disheveled hair, pacing erratically near the foot of the massive bed like a caged beast. The curse, the sheer magnitude of the magic. It is going to tear her apart from the inside out. Before Maeve even attempted to sit up and find the breath to reassure him, the heavy oak doors of the chamber flew open again. Eldra Finch slipped inside, her lined face pale, but her movements sharp and highly purposeful. The aging headmaid had managed to bypass the dangerous chaos erupting in the banquet hall, relying on her decades of navigating the secret, narrow servant passages to reach the royal wing, just seconds behind her sovereign. She immediately locked the heavy iron deadbolts behind her, sealing the room off from the rest of the dangerous, plotting palace. "Arthur," Eldra said breathlessly, rushing straight toward the bedside. She did not bow. She did not hesitate. Her fierce maternal instinct completely overrode any lingering fear of his legendary wrath. "Let me see her. Let me examine the brand." "Do not touch the mark directly, Eldra," Arthur warned sharply, his massive frame tensing with sudden, feral protectiveness. He took a half-step forward, his turbulent gaze flashing with that terrifying golden light again, but he forcefully restrained himself, digging his booted heels into the polished obsidian floor. He stared at Maeve, his expression a chaotic blend of ferocious possession and paralyzing guilt. "Because when I saw you lying there, broken and abandoned, something in me roared that I had to save you, even if saving you destroys me. I reached out without thinking. I forgot the gilded gloves. I forgot the curse." Maeve remained completely frozen on the bed, her blistered fingers instinctively curling into the rich velvet blankets. A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced because she was never there to begin with. Yet, as Arthur's deep voice cracked with such raw, unhidden despair, the solar seal on her collarbone flared with a sympathetic, molten thrum. Her dormant magic reached out instinctively through the fated bond, radiating a profound, soothing heat that actively attempted to quiet the terrifying emotional agony consuming her mate. She had spent her entire life perfecting the art of sheer invisibility, keeping her head bowed and her dormant celestial magic buried beneath thick layers of exhausted obedience. Now, she was the absolute center of the most dangerous storm in Thornmere, inextricably tied to a powerful ruler who was currently unraveling before her very eyes. The ancient text was extremely specific, Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a frantic, agonizing murmur that barely carried over the crackling hearth fire. Priest Caspian's magic is absolute. The hollow mark doesn't just contain your power, it creates a void, an absence where your magic should be. It is designed to weaponize my alpha aura, forcing it into the mate's mortal vessel until their blood freezes solid and their organs turn to necrotic ash. She should be screaming. She should be coughing up black blood. Why isn't she screaming, Eldra? The old woman blatantly ignored his rising panic, relying on her quiet, battered wisdom to maintain control of the terrifying situation. She sat carefully on the edge of the velvet mattress, offering Maeve a deeply reassuring, grounding expression that spoke of years of silent protection. She reached out and gently, methodically pulled back the frayed, damp collar of the ruined servant uniform to fully expose the glowing collarbone. Maeve watched as Arthur braced himself heavily against the sturdy side of a carved mahogany chair. She could clearly see him clenching his square jaw so hard that the thick muscles jumped violently beneath his scarred skin. His broad shoulders remained rigidly locked in absolute dread. From the terrifying stillness in his metallic gaze, Maeve knew exactly what he was desperately bracing himself to witness. He was waiting for the gruesome, horrifying spread of black frost to creep up her delicate neck. His frantic, wide-eyed stare betrayed a paralyzing, suffocating fear that his bare touch had just murdered an innocent girl, leaving him anticipating the undeniable physical proof of her immediate, agonizing death. Instead, Eldra gasped softly, the sound barely audible over the roaring fire. There was absolutely no black frost. There was no necrotic decay, no spreading icy infection, and no shattered blood vessels underneath the surface. The delicate, pale skin of Maeve's neck and chest was completely, miraculously intact. Seared perfectly into the flesh was the blinding solar seal. It was an incredibly intricate, sprawling crest of celestial suns beautifully intertwined with ancient angular wolf runes, but the mark was not behaving like a deadly, parasitic curse. It was behaving like a living, breathing hearth fire. The brand pulsed with a steady, rhythmic, molten golden luminescence, radiating a profound, soothing heat that actively pushed back against the lingering chill of the cold stone room. Witness this, King Arthur. Eldra breathed in absolute awe, her sharp eyes tracing the glowing geometric lines of the ancient brand without actually touching the warm skin. The curse is not consuming her. The magic is not decaying the mortal vessel. Arthur stopped pacing. He stepped cautiously toward the bedside, his massive frame practically vibrating with violently suppressed tension. The heavy scent of ozone and crushed cedar intensified rapidly in the small space as he leaned over the velvet mattress, his wide, disbelieving eyes fixing entirely upon the glowing solar seal. Through the pulsing, intimate connection of the mate bond, Maeve felt the violent, chaotic storm of his alpha aura suddenly begin to quiet. The freezing, suffocating weight of the ancient touch curse that usually surrounded him started to dissolve, actively replaced by the gentle, thrumming warmth radiating directly from her own chest. She could feel her dormant, celestial resonance pushing outward through the tether, actively digesting and purifying the lethal, dark magic of Priest Caspian's decree. As her soothing heat flooded the bond, she observed the staggering, immediate change in the Alpha King. The brutal, defensive tension slowly drained from his massive frame, unknotting his tight muscles. The frantic, agonizing panic that had gripped his broad shoulders completely vanished, leaving him staring at her glowing collarbone in a state of absolute, breathless wonder. "How?" he murmured, his deep, commanding voice trembling with a raw vulnerability that few living souls had ever heard. He slowly, hesitantly reached out his bare right hand. He hovered his heavily scarred fingers just an inch above the glowing collarbone, absolutely terrified that any further contact would instantly break the delicate miracle occurring before him. She is human, a low-born maid. Her mortal frame should have shattered the exact second the curse detonated. How is she absorbing the alpha magic? Eldra leaned in closer, gently adjusting the heavy wool of the royal cloak securely around Maeve's trembling shoulders to ward off any lingering drafts. The head maid's lined eyes softened, filled with a deep, protective understanding that completely transcended the brutal, bloody politics of the royal court. We are small things in a world of teeth, my Maeve. Smallness is a gift. Use it! Eldra whispered so softly that only the two women could hear, her rough, collused thumb gently wiping a stray, silent tear from the girl's pale cheek. She then turned her steely gaze up to the towering, terrified sovereign. She is not merely absorbing your immense power, King Arthur. She is transmuting it. You have spent an entire year believing this dark curse would destroy the first woman you touched, but you did not touch an ordinary woman today. Observe the color of the light. Note the shape of the ancient runes. Maeve lay very still against the silk pillows, her breathing shallow as she watched Arthur stare down at the molten golden glow, illuminating her exhausted face. She saw the profound, life-altering realization hit him like a physical blow, completely stripping away the very last remnants of his formidable, terrifying defenses. The legendary Alpha King slowly lowered himself to the floor beside the bed, his massive knees hitting the obsidian stone with a heavy, defeated thud that echoed through the quiet chamber. He buried his face deep in his scarred hands, his broad shoulders shaking uncontrollably as his composure finally broke. The terrifying, ruthless commander of 10,000 wolves was completely crumbling before her. Through the fated tether, Maeve felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of profound relief and agonizing gratitude flood into her own soul. The bitter, isolating cold that had surrounded him for an entire year was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, weeping warmth. She realized then that he was no longer freezing in the untouchable isolation that the ancient priest had violently condemned him to. The bond hummed with a fierce, protective resonance, whispering a silent, undeniable truth into the quiet room. Destiny had not given him a fragile victim to destroy. It had given him a silent, resilient woman who possessed the exact elemental fire required to thaw his cursed, frozen heart. The quiet, heavily warded sanctuary of the royal chambers was suddenly and violently shattered. A furious, rhythmic pounding erupted against the massive oak double doors, the booming sound vibrating straight through the thick iron hinges and echoing harshly against the vaulted obsidian ceiling. At the edge of the velvet-draped mattress, Arthur Pendragon froze perfectly still. The profound, weeping vulnerability that had just completely unraveled him vanished in a microscopic fraction of a heartbeat. The devastating psychological shift was instantaneous, visceral, and absolutely terrifying to witness. The broken man evaporated like mist, replaced entirely by the ruthless, feral Alpha King, who had conquered 3 distinct territories with nothing but brutal strategy and spilled blood. He rose slowly from the polished stone floor, his massive, heavily scarred frame unfurling to its full towering height. Those familiar grey eyes, previously wide with desperate relief, hardened instantly into glacial, unforgiving chips of winter ice. Through the pulsing, highly intimate connection of the newly formed mate bond, Maeve felt the immediate, catastrophic change in his emotional state. The soothing, desperate warmth he had just projected was suddenly encased in a thick, impenetrable fortress of pure, protective rage. But the terrifying anger was not directed at her. It wrapped around her fragile, exhausted soul like an indestructible iron shield. The somatic feedback was a heavy, rhythmic thrumming of absolute safety and possessive warmth, explicitly declaring to her very bones that she was entirely untouchable. "Stay exactly where you are," Arthur commanded, his deep voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating resonance that literally made the heavy blood-red velvet draperies tremble against the stone walls. "Do not let a single living soul cross that threshold." Eldra Finch nodded sharply, her deeply lined face pale but fiercely resolute. The aging head maid stepped defensively in front of the massive bed, her small frame instinctively shielding the resting, glowing girl from the entrance. Arthur strode toward the barricaded doors with a terrifying, predatory grace, his heavy steel-toed boots entirely silent on the rugs. He did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He grasped the heavy iron deadbolts with his bare, scarred hands and violently threw them open, the ancient metal groaning in loud, piercing protest. Standing in the dimly lit corridor was Duchess Giselle. She had hastily discarded her ruined, wine-stained crimson silk gown, replacing it with a dark, militaristic riding habit constructed of tailored black leather and sharp silver fastenings, a bold, highly calculated visual signal of her intent to seize control of the chaotic narrative. She was closely flanked by a dozen elite, heavily armed pureblood loyalists, and 3 prominent, ambitious northern lords, their thick, calloused hands resting menacingly against the heavy iron hilts of their broadswords. The suffocating scent of pack politics, elitist greed, and impending violence flooded into the entryway, clashing violently with the warm cedar and ozone aroma of the royal sanctuary. The noblewoman fiercely assumed she could leverage the chaos to force him to discard the servant and sever the bond. She was wrong, because the Alpha King had finally discovered the truth, and he was fully prepared to burn the world for what was his. "King Arthur," Giselle began, her voice sharp and dripping with toxic, condescending authority. She blatantly refused to bow. Instead, she stepped forward, attempting to peer past his immensely broad shoulders into the dim firelit chamber where the golden light pulsed. "The court is in an absolute, uncontrollable uproar. The kingdom is teetering on the very edge of unprecedented political ruin. You cannot possibly entertain this catastrophic accident. The girl is a literal floor scrubber, a lowly, unranked, defective servant who clearly orchestrated this collision to steal the crown." Arthur did not move a single muscle. He stood perfectly rigid, completely blocking the doorway with his massive chest. The ambient temperature in the stone corridor plummeted instantly, a sheer, physical manifestation of his raging alpha aura, leaking directly into the physical world. Thick layers of white frost began to rapidly crystallize along the dark stone walls, creeping toward the polished boots of the visiting lords. "You have exactly 3 seconds to step back from my private quarters, Giselle," the king stated, his tone shockingly quiet, yet possessing a lethal, razor-sharp edge that sliced straight through the suffocating tension. The Duchess's jaw tightened fiercely, her sweet, heavily practiced facade cracking under the immense, crushing pressure of his dominance, but her blinding, toxic ambition forced her to push forward against all rational survival instincts. "The ancestral lore of the Great Divide is absolutely clear on corrupted magic," she hissed, her eyes gleaming with pure, unadulterated venom. "A low-born, filthy maid cannot legally hold the sacred title of Queen of Thornmere. It will immediately incite a massive rebellion among the pure-blood elite. For the stability of the realm, the bond must be severed immediately. The impostor must be handed over to the High Council for execution. It is the only legal way to reset the ancient curse and protect your sovereign reign." Inside the heavily warded chamber, Maeve Thorne gasped softly, her raw, blistered fingers clutching the heavy silk blankets in sudden terror. The brutal reality of the demand echoed sickeningly in the quiet room. Severing a completed fated mate bond was a highly illegal, excruciating process that required violently draining the weaker mate's blood entirely on a stone altar. The ambitious rival was not just asking for a simple annulment. She was loudly demanding a gruesome public murder, to clear her own bloody path to the throne. The somatic feedback crashing through the fated tether felt exactly like a detonating volcano. Maeve felt Arthur's inner beast completely snap its heavy, restraining iron chains. "Execution," Arthur whispered, the single word dripping with such profound, unadulterated menace that two of the heavily armed pure-blood loyalists instinctively took a terrified, stumbling step backward. Without a single additional warning motion, the Alpha King unleashed the full, catastrophic weight of his suppression aura. It was not a mere intimidating display of power. It was a devastating, physical crushing force. The sheer pressure slammed down upon the narrow corridor like a falling slab of solid granite. Giselle gasped sharply, her hands flying desperately to her throat, as all the oxygen was violently ripped from the freezing air. The three arrogant northern lords immediately collapsed to their knees on the frost-covered stone, their heavy armor clattering loudly against the marble as they physically choked and gagged on the suffocating, unyielding dominance of their ruler. Arthur took a single, deliberate step out of the chamber, looming over the kneeling, gasping woman like an ancient, wrathful god of war. The king's tempestuous gaze shifted instantly, bleeding into a burning, feral, molten gold that completely overshadowed the flickering torches on the walls. "Listen to me very carefully, because I will only say this once," he commanded, his voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable sovereignty. "She is not a maid. She is not an impostor. She is the fated mate chosen by the ancient magic and the undeniable sovereign queen of Thornmere. The bond is permanent. It will never be severed." Giselle looked up at him, her flawless face pale and contorted in sheer, helpless terror, completely unable to draw a full breath under the crushing weight of his absolute aura. "If any soul in this entire kingdom dares to speak a single word against her," Arthur continued, his lethal glowing gaze sweeping slowly over the trembling, kneeling guards who were silently begging for mercy. "If any one of you even looks in the general direction of these doors, I will not bother with a formal trial. I will tear your throats out with my own bare hands, and I will leave your remains for the scavengers. Now, get out of my sight." He violently withdrew the crushing aura, causing the intruders to collapse forward against the freezing stone, gasping desperately for life-saving air. Humiliated, terrified, and utterly defeated, the Duchess scrambled frantically to her feet, her previous elitist arrogance completely shattered into dust. The loyalists dragged the struggling lords backward, fleeing down the dark, twisting corridor as quickly as their trembling legs could carry them, completely abandoning their attempted coup. Arthur did not bother to watch them leave. He grabbed the heavy iron handles and slammed the massive oak doors shut, sliding the thick deadbolts back into place, with a definitive, ringing crash that echoed with finality. The immediate political threat was neutralized, but the toxic echoes of the court's venom still lingered heavily in the frigid air. The heavy, echoing thud of the closing doors seemed to finalize a permanent barrier between the violent, plotting world outside and the quiet, intimate sanctuary within. Arthur leaned heavily against the thick oak wood for a long, silent moment, taking a slow, deep breath to forcibly rein in his raging inner beast. He methodically rubbed his bare, heavily scarred palms against the sides of his dark trousers, a lingering, anxious, nervous habit resulting from a full year of wearing the suffocating gilded gloves. When he finally turned back toward the center of the expansive room, the terrifying, feral commander vanished once again, replaced entirely by a man looking at Maeve with an expression of profound, gentle reverence. He walked slowly back to the velvet-draped mattress, his heavy boots making almost no sound on the polished obsidian floor, highly conscious of not startling her. As Maeve watched his gentle approach, a profound realization settled deep into her bones. She had spent her life terrified of the alpha predators in this keep, but this man was different, because monsters do not kneel in shattered glass, because monsters do not tremble at the sight of a fragile maid. Because monsters do not look at me the way you do, she thought, her racing pulse finally beginning to steady as his warm, cedar-scented presence washed over her. Eldra let out a long, shaky breath, her stiff posture relaxing slightly as the immediate danger passed. She stepped forward, gently smoothing the pristine silk sheets around Maeve's resting legs. "You have successfully bought us time, King Arthur," the aging headmaid murmured, her voice steady but laced with deep, pragmatic concern. "But the Duchess is entirely right about one specific thing. The pureblood elite will never simply accept a low-born servant as their sovereign queen on your word alone. They will ruthlessly demand official, indisputable proof that the ancient touch curse has not been corrupted. They will insist that the magic is formally verified." Arthur's square jaw tightened in visible frustration. "I do not care what the elite demand. I will absolutely not subject her to a hostile, biased tribunal where they can manipulate the laws to harm her." "You will not have to," Eldra countered smoothly, her sharp, observant eyes flicking toward the glowing solar seal, actively pulsing on Maeve's pale collarbone. "We do not need the corrupt council. We only need the one man whose absolute magical authority supersedes their petty political laws. We need Priest Caspian." The mere mention of the ancient priest's name sent a sharp, involuntary shiver of dread racing down Maeve's spine. Priest Caspian was the very architect of this terrifying situation, the bitter, uncompromising old man who had violently condemned the Alpha King to a life of utter, untouchable isolation. To summon him here was to invite the cruel creator of the nightmare into the very room where the magic was actively mutating. "He will immediately know the curse did not function as he designed it," Arthur said, his broad brow furrowing in deep apprehension. He sat carefully on the very edge of the velvet mattress, ensuring he kept a highly respectful physical distance from Maeve, deeply mindful of her exhausted, fragile state. The dark decree was designed to completely hollow out the host, creating an irreversible void where their soul should reside. If Caspian believes the magic is simply unstable or delayed, he might attempt to forcefully banish the bond to save my life. He cannot banish what has been completely, fundamentally transmuted, Eldra insisted, stepping back to gather the discarded, frayed pieces of Maeve's ruined servant uniform, holding the fabric like a discarded relic of a past life. "Summon him, Arthur. Let the arrogant architect of the curse witness his own spectacular failure." 30 incredibly tense minutes later, the heavy iron deadbolts were thrown open once again to admit the High Priest of Thornmere. Priest Caspian entered the royal chambers like a creeping, suffocating shadow. He was an incredibly ancient, frail man, draped in heavily layered robes of ash-grey wool. The distinct, overwhelming scent of burned parchment, dried bitter herbs, and old, metallic blood clung stubbornly to his garments, a terrifying sensory hallmark of his dark, ancestral rituals. His cloudy, cataract-filled eyes scanned the dim, fire-lit room, fully expecting to find the gruesome, bloody aftermath of his own absolute decree. He fully anticipated seeing King Arthur standing over the shattered, necrotic, frozen corpse of a careless servant who had foolishly touched the crown. Instead, his gaze locked instantly onto the massive velvet bed. Maeve was sitting up, her aching back heavily supported by a mountain of pristine silk pillows. She was incredibly pale, and her raw, blistered hands were tightly clasped in her lap to hide their trembling, but she was undeniably, vibrantly alive. And pulsing beautifully against the delicate skin of her collarbone was the solar seal, casting its molten, golden luminescence across the dark shadows of the opulent room, pushing back the gloom with a steady, rhythmic heartbeat of pure light. Caspian froze perfectly still in the center of the obsidian floor, his gnarled, bony fingers tightening drastically around the heavy, rune-carved wooden staff he used to support his frail weight. This is an absolute biological impossibility," the ancient priest whispered, his voice cracking harshly like dry, brittle autumn leaves being crushed underfoot. "She is a low-born human vessel, The lethal winter frost of the alpha aura should have instantly shattered her fragile blood vessels. She should be reduced to necrotic, freezing ash. She is entirely unharmed, Arthur stated firmly, rising from his chair to stand protectively near the headboard. His massive, imposing presence was a clear, silent, and highly lethal warning to the priest to tread extremely carefully. The curse detonated flawlessly, the ancient magic anchored perfectly into her skin. Yet, my lethal aura did not destroy her. Caspian did not respond to the king's dangerous warning. His cloudy eyes were entirely fixated on the glowing, intricate geometric runes intertwining on Maeve's skin. Slowly, methodically, he approached the bedside, his boots dragging slightly against the stone. He reached deep into the hidden pockets of his heavy grey robes and retrieved a small, intricately carved brass censer attached to a long, tarnished silver chain. "I must formally inspect the magical resonance," the priest murmured, his heavily wrinkled hands trembling slightly as he ignited the contents of the brass censer with a mere, practiced flick of his thumb against a flint striker. The sharp, incredibly pungent aroma of burning dried nightshade and white sage immediately filled the confined space, burning the back of Maeve's throat. The heavy, dark grey smoke billowed upward in thick plumes, curling ominously through the ambient warmth of the crackling hearth fire. Caspian began to chant in the forgotten, guttural tongue of the first wolves, his voice dropping into a low, rhythmic, vibrating cadence that resonated uncomfortably in Maeve's aching teeth and rattled the glass panes of the windows. He gently swung the brass censer back and forth like a pendulum, allowing the thick, dark diagnostic smoke to drift deliberately over Maeve's glowing collarbone. The ancient ritual was designed to visually expose the necrotic decay of the curse. If the dark magic was secretly destroying her from the inside out, the smoke would turn violently black and immediately smell of rotting flesh and stagnant water. Maeve held her breath, her heart racing frantically as the heavy grey smoke physically touched her warm skin. The chemical reaction was instantaneous and completely breathtaking. The very second the dark, probing smoke made contact with the golden luminescence of the celestial mark, it did not turn black. It did not smell of decay or death. Instead, the smoke flared outward into a shimmering, brilliant cloud of floating golden stardust, sparkling beautifully in the dim air before dissolving entirely into a warm, fragrant mist that smelled distinctly of blooming summer gardenias, sun-baked earth, and fresh rain. The brass censer slipped completely from Caspian's trembling fingers. It clattered loudly against the polished obsidian floor, spilling the remaining burning herbs across the stone in a scattered trail of dying embers. The ancient priest stumbled backward, his frail knees giving out entirely as he collapsed onto the hard floor. He stared up at the terrified serving girl with an expression of absolute, unadulterated awe, completely ignoring the burning herbs near his robes. You are not a human servant," Caspian stammered, his cloudy eyes wide with a profound, terrifying, and world-shifting realization. He looked frantically between Arthur's hardened face and Maeve's glowing mark, his hands shaking violently. The curse failed because the void it attempted to create was instantly filled. The alpha magic did not shatter her mortal vessel because she is not a mere mortal. Do you not see the specific, undeniable shape of those ancient runes? Do you not recognize the scent of the summer sun? Arthur stepped forward, his heart pounding a heavy, frantic rhythm against his ribs, the somatic feedback of his shock echoing through the bond. "Speak clearly, priest. What is she?" "She possesses the unbroken blood of the Sunborn," Caspian breathed, bowing his grey head so deeply that his wrinkled forehead nearly touched the cold stone floor in absolute reverence. A divine, celestial lineage completely thought to be extinct for over 1,000 years. Her dormant magic is the absolute elemental opposite of your destructive winter frost. She didn't merely survive your toxic alpha aura, King Arthur. Her celestial fire completely digested it. It purified the dark magic. Maeve stared at the kneeling man, her mind spinning wildly, unable to fully process the magnitude of the words. The strange, unexplainable warmth she had hidden deep inside her chest for 19 years, the resilient, stubborn heat that had kept her alive through the freezing, brutal winters of the lower keep, was not a strange, dangerous anomaly. It was a dormant goddess lineage, a sacred, ancient fire, waiting patiently for the exact right catastrophic catalyst to finally awaken. The ancient touch curse is broken, Caspian continued, his voice echoing with a reverent, trembling finality that shifted the very foundations of the kingdom. Or rather, it has been permanently, flawlessly transmuted. Destiny did not allow you to stumble into a fragile victim, Arthur. Fate guided your bare hand directly to the absolute only living creature in the entire realm capable of surviving your touch. The curse has been converted into a divine blessing. Arthur stood completely paralyzed, the sheer magnitude of the priest's revelation crashing over his broad shoulders like a massive tidal wave. He looked down at Maeve, his silvery irises softening into a look of such intense, overwhelming devotion and relief that it made her breath catch painfully in her throat. He had spent an agonizing, lonely year believing his own hands were lethal weapons, completely terrified of his own monstrous nature. Now he realized he had not ruined this quiet, resilient girl. Instead, her hidden, quiet strength had miraculously saved his condemned soul. Because being bound to the most dangerous man in the realm had allowed her to be found by a better destiny, a better kingdom, a better life, and she would never, ever look back. As Arthur slowly approached the bed again and gently, reverently took her blistered hand in his bare, scarred palms, feeling the warm, safe pulse of her magic against his skin, Maeve knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was no longer invisible, and she would never have to scrub the cold, dark floors of the obsidian keep ever again. Gathering his scattered herbs, Priest Caspian bowed deeply one final time, and departed the sanctuary under the highly watchful, unforgiving eyes of the royal guards, allowing the immediate weight of his shocking revelation to finally settle. For 3 consecutive days, the absolute center of the royal estate remained completely sealed off from the political storms raging outside. The heavily warded royal chambers had become an isolated, luxurious sanctuary entirely dedicated to the delicate recovery of the kingdom's newly discovered sovereign. Outside the thick crystal windows, the perpetual winter storms of the Great Divide battered the obsidian walls, but the howling winds could not penetrate the absolute safety of the king's private domain. The massive hearth crackled with thick logs of ancient pine, casting a warm, flickering amber light across the dark stone. This room, once a cold and terrifying prison for a cursed monarch, had been miraculously transformed into a haven of profound peace. The heavy scent of ancient books, polished mahogany, and Arthur's natural alpha scent, a deeply comforting blend of cedar, rain, and winter frost, filled the expansive room, entirely erasing the damp, mouldy smell of the servants' quarters that Maeve had endured her entire life. For the first time in 19 years, she was allowed to simply exist without fear of punishment. Maeve Thorne sat near the roaring hearth fire, her slender frame wrapped tightly in a massive heavy robe spun from pristine white mountain silk. The sheer, incomprehensible luxury of her new existence still felt entirely alien to her coal-used skin. For 19 agonizing years, she had known only the biting chill of the lower servant quarters, the harsh, unforgiving reprimands of the kitchen staff, and the chemical sting of lye soap eating deeply into her raw knuckles. Now her blistered hands were carefully bandaged in soft linen, treated daily with expensive, soothing salves crafted from crushed pearl and winter mint. The maids who had once ignored her or shoved her aside now bowed their heads respectfully whenever they brought fresh linens. But the most profound change was not the opulent velvet draperies, the towering bookcases lining the walls, or the rich, decadent meals delivered on silver platters. It was the deep, unyielding warmth, radiating steadily from her own collarbone. The solar seal was a living, breathing entity. The ancient, intricately woven geometric runes pulsed with a soft, molten golden luminescence beneath the collar of her silk robe, a stark contrast to the bruised, exhausted skin of her neck. It was a constant, somatic anchor, humming with a quiet, celestial resonance that actively communicated with the vast, heavy alpha magic roaming the sprawling palace. Through the fated tether, Maeve could physically feel Arthur Pendragon's presence, even when he was rooms away. She felt his heavy, protective vigilance guarding the outer corridors like a living fortress, an impenetrable wall of shadow and teeth standing between her and the hostile elite. The connection was startlingly intimate, an unbroken river of warmth that constantly reassured her fragile human heart. She felt the lingering, heavy echoes of his profound guilt regarding the touch curse that had nearly destroyed them both. He still believed he was a monster who had accidentally ruined her life. But most of all, she felt the overwhelming, desperate devotion that had completely replaced the terrifying winter frost of his cursed aura. It was a quiet, thrumming promise that she would never be discarded again, a vow written not in words, but in the constant, burning heat of his magic. But outside the heavy iron-reinforced doors, the ambitious pure-blood elite were not resting. Eldra Finch had quietly warned Maeve just that morning, the aging mentor's observant eyes shadowed with deep concern as she changed the bandages. Duchess Giselle had been bitterly humiliated, her ruthless attempt to force an immediate execution completely crushed beneath the Alpha King's dominant wrath. However, toxic ambition did not die easily in the icy heart of the kingdom. Stripped of her political leverage and facing the catastrophic reality that a low-born maid now held the sacred crown, the rival noblewoman had resorted to a desperate, lethal cowardice. If the elite could not legally sever the fated bond through a High Council tribunal, they would quietly, permanently stop the fragile human heart that anchored the magic. They believed that without Maeve, the Alpha King would simply revert to his cold, untouchable state, allowing the matriarchs to regain control. The heavy oak doors of the royal chamber clicked open softly, the sound barely audible over the crackling hearth fire. Maeve turned her head, expecting to see Eldra returning with an armful of fresh, warm linens, or perhaps another cup of healing broth to soothe her throat. Instead, a young, uncontrollably trembling servant boy slipped into the firelit room. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the polished obsidian floor, his pale hands trembling uncontrollably. The delicate porcelain teacup on his silver tray rattled loudly against its matching saucer. His breathing was shallow, erratic, like a trapped animal fully aware it was participating in a fatal mistake. "Your evening tea, my lady," the boy whispered, his youthful voice cracking with barely contained terror. He hastily set the tray down on the small mahogany table near the hearth, practically sprinting backward toward the heavy doors before Maeve could even offer a gentle word of thanks or ask for his name. Maeve frowned slightly at the boy's frantic departure, but the lingering exhaustion in her recovering muscles quickly distracted her from the strange interaction. The rich, steaming aroma of brewed chamomile and sweet mountain honey drifted up from the delicate porcelain cup, filling the warm space with an inviting, familiar scent. She reached out with her bandaged fingers, lifting the warm cup carefully to her pale lips. She desperately welcomed the soothing heat, seeking to ease the lingering tightness in her throat caused by days of overwhelming emotional shock and physical strain. She closed her eyes, letting the firelight warm her skin. She took a long, slow sip. The immediate sensory transition was chillingly unnatural. The liquid did not taste like sweet honey or floral chamomile. It tasted exactly like jagged, rusted iron and frozen ash. Before Maeve could even pull the porcelain cup away from her mouth, a sudden, catastrophic agony exploded deep inside her stomach. The teacup slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering into dozens of sharp white pieces across the dark stone floor. The hot liquid splashed against the hem of her silk robe, but she could not feel the heat. She could not feel anything except the sudden, terrifying avalanche of pure, biting ice, unforgivingly flooding directly into her bloodstream. The ancient alchemical poison acted with brutal, unnatural efficiency. It was a cowardly weapon favored by the high-born, entirely undetectable until it was far too late. It did not merely attack her mortal organs. It relentlessly hunted the magical tether, anchoring her soul to the Alpha King. It was designed to freeze the mate bond at its source, turning the warm, fated connection into a jagged, lethal fault line that would shatter them both. Maeve collapsed heavily onto her hands and knees, her vision instantly blurring into a chaotic swirl of dark, suffocating shadows. The luxurious velvet rug scraped against her palms as she desperately tried to draw a breath, but her lungs absolutely refused to expand. Her throat constricted violently, locked in a paralyzing, freezing spasm that felt as if she had swallowed jagged glass mixed with winter ice. She did not scream. She did not weep. She was a survivor of the dark citadel's lowest depths, and her resilient body fought back instinctively. She only gripped the thick fabric of the rugs, her corlused knuckles turning bone white as the unnatural freezing toxin raced directly toward her collarbone. The warm, protective thrumming of the divine brand abruptly vanished. The beautiful molten golden light, illuminating her pale skin, flickered wildly, fighting a losing battle against the rapidly encroaching darkness. The intricate celestial suns and ancient wolf runes began distorting rapidly, turning a sickly, bruised purple as the lethal synthetic venom forcefully attempted to sever the indestructible fated mate bond. The immense cold seeped into her very marrow, threatening to extinguish the rare sunborn magic before it could fully bloom. As her vision went entirely black, Maeve was not alone in her agonizing suffering. Without a single microsecond of warning, the physical feedback of the mate bond slammed back into her fading consciousness with the catastrophic force of a falling meteor. She felt it all. Miles away, or perhaps only corridors away, the sheer unimaginable magnitude of Arthur's answering agony exploded across the tether. Through the rapidly fading pulse of the solar seal, Maeve felt a raw, deafening roar of pure agony tear through the king's throat. She could feel his massive hands blindly grabbing at a heavy marble pillar and splintering it to absolute dust in his frantic desperation. Through the deep, intimate tether binding their souls, she physically felt him collapse heavily to his knees on the cold stone of the outer hall. His broad shoulders heaved erratically as a terrifying, suffocating ice perfectly mirrored in his own lungs. He was not being poisoned, but through their absolute connection, he was drowning in the exact same lethal alchemical venom that was currently tearing through her fragile veins. The fated bond ensured that whatever killed the newly chosen queen would drag the Alpha King down into the exact same dark abyss. And then, the paralyzing agony across the bond was completely overshadowed by a sudden, apocalyptic wave of feral terror. The ancient touch curse had not destroyed her, but someone inside his own impenetrable fortress was currently murdering the other half of his soul. Maeve felt his human mind completely snap under the crushing weight of the emotional trauma. The fragile, logical restraint he had utilized to govern his kingdom instantly evaporated, replaced entirely by the chaotic, unstoppable protective instincts of his inner beast. He had spent his entire reign locked in lonely isolation, wearing those heavily enchanted gilded gloves to protect the world from his cursed touch. Now, the one person who had brought him the sun was dying in the dark, and he would not allow the kingdom to take her from him. Lying paralyzed on the obsidian floor, fighting desperately for a single breath, Maeve felt the entire onyx palace begin to tremble. Distant, thundering crashes echoed through the heavy stone walls. He was coming. She felt his supernatural, blinding speed as he tore through the cavernous, torch-lit corridors. The destructive path of his frantic sprint vibrated directly into her aching bones. The heavy scent of ozone, rain, and relentless, predatory wrath bled into the room, a mere heartbeat before the physical impact. He did not bother reaching for the heavy iron handles. The thick oak double doors of the royal chamber exploded inward, shattering the ancient wood and heavy iron deadbolts into 1,000 splintered, flying pieces. Arthur burst into the firelit sanctuary, the heavy dust of the ruined doors swirling violently around his towering frame. Through her half-closed, blurring eyes, Maeve saw his pale eyes lock onto her with an expression of pure, desperate panic, fixing instantly onto her fragile, convulsing figure on the rug. He took in the horrifying sight of her pale face completely drained of color. He saw the beautiful, glowing brand on her collarbone, flashing frantically between a sickly, poisoned purple and a desperate dying gold. The distinct, metallic stench of the freezing toxin hit his enhanced olfactory senses, an unmistakable scent that explicitly confirmed the cowardly assassination attempt from the rival elite. The sight of her broken, suffocating body completely shattered the final, agonizing barrier holding his primal nature in check. Arthur let out a devastating, ear-splitting howl that loudly rattled the shattered glass of the windows, a sound of such pure, unfathomable grief that it silenced the entire palace. His towering human frame could no longer contain the sheer, catastrophic magnitude of his protective panic. Right there in the center of the opulent bedroom, ignoring every protocol of his royal lineage and every mandate of the High Council, the Alpha King surrendered entirely to the beast. The physical transformation was immediate, brutal, and completely terrifying. His broad shoulders heavily expanded, the heavy fabric of his royal tunic ripping to shreds as massive, hardened muscles rapidly reconstructed themselves beneath the skin. The sickening crack of elongating bones echoed over the roaring fire. His heavily scarred human skin was instantly swallowed by a thick, coarse coat of midnight black fur. His jaw elongated into a terrifying, lethal muzzle, lined with razor-sharp, bone-crushing teeth. Within seconds, the civilized, restrained monarch vanished, replaced entirely by a colossal, monstrous wolf that stood nearly as tall as a war horse. The beast was an apex predator of ancient mythological proportions, its massive paws gouged deep, jagged scratches directly into the polished obsidian stone. The ambient temperature in the room instantly skyrocketed, the colossal wolf radiating a raw, suffocating furnace heat that relentlessly pushed back against the encroaching chill of the icy alchemical poison. The massive black wolf closed the distance to Maeve in a single, powerful leap. It did not care about the spilled tea or the shattered porcelain fragments digging into the rugs. It loomed directly over her fragile, trembling body, planting its massive, fur-covered paws firmly on either side of her shoulders to create a completely impenetrable physical shield against the entire world. The wolf lowered its massive, terrifying head, its molten golden eyes burning with an intense, frantic devotion. It pressed its hot, wet nose gently against the bruising, poisoned skin of her collarbone, letting out a deep, vibrating whine that sounded impossibly broken, coming from such a colossal monster. The sheer, overwhelming proximity of the beast's raw alpha magic acted as a massive, elemental catalyst. The fated mate bond, previously suffocating under the weight of the freezing poison, suddenly flared wide open. The wolf was desperately funneling its own immense, burning life force directly through the tether, creating a roaring, protective firewall around Maeve's struggling heart. It offered its own immense vitality, fully willing to drain itself into absolute nothingness, just to keep her lungs expanding. The dormant celestial fire buried deep within Maeve's sun-born bloodline felt the massive influx of her mate's absolute devotion. The ancient magic recognized the pure, unconditional offering. It flared awake. A blinding, explosive wave of pure, molten golden light erupted from Maeve's chest, completely illuminating the massive black wolf standing over her. The celestial heat was unimaginable, a roaring summer sun igniting directly inside her frozen veins. The pure, divine magic aggressively hunted down every single microscopic trace of the deadly toxin, relentlessly burning the cold alchemical taint entirely out of her bloodstream. The magic was ancient, absolute, and fiercely protective of its chosen vessel. Maeve lurched forward with a sudden, desperate gasp. She coughed harshly, expelling a thick, unnatural wave of freezing mist from her lungs as the toxin evaporated into absolute nothingness. The poison was completely rejected, purged entirely from her fragile human vessel by the overwhelming combination of the beast's sacrifice and her own awakened goddess lineage. She collapsed backward against the velvet rugs, her chest heaving as pure, life-saving oxygen finally flooded back into her burning lungs. The sickly purple bruising on her collarbone rapidly dissolved, replaced once again by the steady, beautiful molten golden luminescence of the fully restored sunmark. Above her, the colossal black wolf let out a long, heavy huff of hot air, its massive frame trembling fiercely with the sudden, catastrophic relief. The beast gently nudged her pale cheek with its large snout, inhaling her sweet, warm scent of gardenias and rain to absolutely verify that the lethal taint of the poison was completely eradicated. Once the primal, protective instinct was fully satisfied that she was finally safe, the terrifying monster slowly began to recede. The thick black fur dissolved rapidly back into heavily scarred, pale skin. The massive bone-crushing frame shrank, shifting smoothly back into the broad, muscular shoulders of the human king. Arthur collapsed heavily onto the obsidian stone right beside her, completely stripped of his royal garments, bare and utterly vulnerable in the ambient firelight. The raw, jagged scars that marred his chest and arms were starkly visible, a physical map of a lifetime spent surviving brutal wars and assassination attempts. He did not bother to search for the heavy, restrictive gilded gloves that had ruled his miserable life for a year. The touch curse was no longer a lethal threat between them, and he desperately needed the tactile, undeniable reality of her skin beneath his fingers. The fearsome sovereign did not attempt to reclaim his towering, untouchable authority. He did not shout for his royal guards to secure the perimeter, nor did he demand immediate political vengeance against the ambitious purebloods who had orchestrated this attack. Instead, he crawled frantically across the cold stone floor, his trembling arms reaching out to gather her small, exhausted body tightly against his broad, bare chest. Arthur buried his face directly into the crook of her neck, right over the glowing, pulsing warmth of the radiant crest. And then, the ruthless, terrifying commander of the kingdom completely broke down. He wept. The heavy, agonizing sobs tore brutally through his broad chest, echoing loudly in the quiet, ruined sanctuary. He clung to her with a desperate, terrifying tightness, his large, calloused hands gently cradling the back of her head as if she were made of the most fragile, spun glass in the entire universe. His tears were hot against her pale skin, washing away the lingering chill of the near-death experience. He was a man who had commanded vast armies and conquered rival territories, yet right now, his entire world was reduced to the shallow, fragile breath entering her lungs. "I have you," Arthur choked out, his deep voice completely shattered by the sheer trauma of nearly losing her. He pressed a desperate, reverent kiss against her bandaged fingers, completely surrendering his entire existence to the quiet maid in his arms. The fated bond thrummed between them, radiating a fierce, undeniable heat that completely banished the last remnants of the winter frost. "I have you. I swear on my soul they will never touch you again. I will tear this entire palace down to the foundation stones before I let them hurt you. I will burn their ancestral lands to ash. No one will ever, ever hurt you again." Because when he saw her lying there, broken and abandoned, something in him roared that he had to save her, even if saving her destroyed him. Maeve leaned her exhausted head against his warm, heaving chest, listening to the frantic, erratic beating of his powerful heart. She slowly lifted her trembling, bandaged hand, gently tangling her fingers into his dark, disheveled hair to soothe his agonizing panic. The immense, terrifying monster the entire kingdom feared was currently kneeling on the shattered floor, weeping uncontrollably, because a low-born servant had almost stopped breathing. Through the golden, pulsing resonance of the fated bond, Maeve felt the absolute, undeniable truth of his vow settling deeply into her own recovering bones. Duchess Giselle and the ambitious court had just played their final, deadly hand, completely unaware that their cowardly poison had not broken the tether. Instead, it had only unleashed a terrifying, protective devotion that would absolutely guarantee their total destruction. As the silver-tinted light of dawn finally began to reflect against Arthur's bare, heavily scarred skin, the deep, lingering ache in his recovering muscles served as a stark, physical reminder of the monstrous shift he had endured to save her. The morning following the assassination attempt broke over the Onyx Palace, not with the usual biting, suffocating winter gloom, but with an eerie, breathless stillness. The cavernous grand throne room, a sprawling architectural marvel carved entirely from unforgiving black marble and ancient shadow, was packed shoulder to shoulder with the highest-ranking pure-blood elite of Thornmere. Yet, despite the massive gathering of arrogant lords and ambitious matriarchs, absolute silence reigned. The heavy, aggressive scent of pack politics and elitist greed that usually choked the hall had been completely eradicated, replaced entirely by the sharp, terrifying ozone of raw alpha dominance. King Arthur Pendragon sat upon the massive obsidian throne, but the fearsome monarch was fundamentally changed. He was no longer the isolated, rigid prisoner of an ancient decree. He was a sovereign who had nearly lost his very soul to a coward's poison, and he had come to collect the ultimate, unforgiving debt. Standing perfectly still beside the dark throne was Maeve Thorne. She did not kneel on the freezing floor. She did not hold a coarse, bristle-haired brush or a heavy bucket of icy water. Instead, she stood tall, draped in an exquisite, sweeping gown of pristine white mountain silk and heavy gold embroidery that completely dwarfed the ruined cotton uniform she had worn just days ago. Her hands were still carefully wrapped in soft linen bandages, a quiet, lingering testament to her grueling past, but her posture radiated a quiet, unshakable dignity. The intricate, geometric runes of the golden brand pulsed with a steady, molten, golden luminescence against the pale skin of her collarbone, visibly declaring her undeniable status to every terrified spectator in the room. Through the deeply anchored fated mate bond, Maeve felt the sheer, catastrophic weight of Arthur's protective vigilance. He did not wear the heavily enchanted gilded gloves. His massive, heavily scarred hands were completely bare, resting with astonishing, deliberate gentleness against the small of her back. The physical contact was a constant, thrumming anchor of raw heat, sending waves of soothing, cedar-scented magic directly into her recovering veins. Every time his powerful heart beat, a sympathetic pulse echoed perfectly within her own chest, explicitly reassuring her that the absolute horrors of the previous night were over. She was safe, she was seen, and the ruthless Alpha King was fully prepared to dismantle his own court, to keep it that way. In the dead center of the polished marble floor stood Duchess Giselle Vance. The ambitious noblewoman had lost the exquisite, practiced facade of sweet innocence. She wore a severe, high-collared gown of midnight velvet, her spine rigidly straight as she desperately attempted to project the supreme, untouchable authority of her pure-blood lineage. But her flawless face was unnaturally pale, and her dark eyes darted frantically toward the heavy iron-wrought doors, fully aware that she was completely trapped. She had gambled her entire political empire on the lethal, untraceable efficiency of the alchemical poison, arrogant enough to believe that a low-born servant would simply perish in the dark without consequence. The silver-tinted light of dawn reflected off Arthur's bare skin, his massive frame still deeply sore from the agonizing, feral wolf shift that had saved Maeve's life just hours prior. Giselle didn't know that the man sitting upon the throne had completely surrendered his monstrous heart to the very girl she tried to murder. She didn't know that the fated tether had dragged the king through the exact same freezing, agonizing hell of the synthetic venom. And she definitely didn't know that her cowardly assassination attempt had fundamentally awakened a dormant, celestial goddess lineage that was about to permanently rewrite the history of the Great Divide. "Bring forth the evidence," Arthur commanded, his deep, vibrating voice cutting through the tense, freezing air like a sharpened broadsword. He did not shout. He did not need to. The lethal, quiet resonance of his tone physically rattled the surviving stained glass windows and forced the surrounding lords to drop their gazes to their polished boots in sheer terror. From the deep shadows near the royal dais, Priest Caspian Vane stepped forward. The ancient frail high priest moved with a solemn, heavy purpose, his heavy ash-grey robes dragging silently across the stone. He held a small, pristine glass vial up to the ambient light of the flickering wall sconces. Inside the transparent glass lay the shattered, jagged white fragments of a delicate porcelain teacup, heavily coated in a thick, unnatural residue that looked exactly like frozen, rusted iron. The distinct, metallic stench of the freezing toxin immediately permeated the front rows of the gathered court, causing several elite alphas to physically recoil from the vile, cowardly scent. The ancient laws of Thornmere dictate that the fated mate bond is a sacred, untouchable decree woven by the moon goddess herself, Caspian declared, his brittle, cracking voice echoing with uncompromising authority. He turned his cloudy, cataract-filled eyes directly upon the trembling Duchess. To strike at the chosen vessel is to strike directly at the soul of the king. Last night, an incredibly rare, highly concentrated alchemical poison was deliberately introduced into the royal sanctuary. It is a synthetic, cowardly venom specifically engineered to freeze the magical tether and shatter the mortal heart. "This is an absolute outrage," Giselle shrieked, her voice pitching into a desperate, shrill panic as she frantically sought an ally among the silent, kneeling lords. "You cannot possibly accuse the House of Vance of such a base, dishonorable crime. I am a high-born pureblood. I demand a formal tribunal. That filthy servant could have ingested anything in her pathetic, squalid quarters before she manipulated her way into the royal wing." Arthur's storm-grey eyes shifted instantly, bleeding into a burning, feral molten gold. The ambient temperature in the cavernous hall skyrocketed as his inner beast pushed against the surface of his skin, demanding immediate, violent retribution. But the king did not transform. He simply tightened his bare, warm grip on Maeve's waist, grounding his raging fury in the steady, beautiful pulse of her sunborn magic. "Do not insult my intelligence, Giselle," Arthur murmured, the terrifyingly quiet threat forcing the rival noblewoman to snap her mouth shut. "My tracker wolves raided your private estate before the sun even crested the horizon. They found the hidden, lead-lined strongbox beneath your floorboards. They found the empty glass vials reeking of rusted iron and frozen ash. They found the terrified servant boy you violently threatened into delivering the tray, who has already provided a full signed confession detailing your exact treasonous instructions." The crushing reality of her failure slammed into the accused matriarch. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow, fragile porcelain doll. She stumbled backward, her expensive velvet gown tangling around her trembling legs. She had spent years meticulously plotting to claim the throne, manipulating the court, and exploiting the ancient touch curse to isolate the sovereign. Now, the undeniable proof of her treason was laid bare before the entire kingdom, and there was absolutely no political maneuver left to save her. "I did it for the realm," Giselle suddenly screamed, abandoning her dignified composure as tears of furious humiliation spilled over her cheeks. She pointed a shaking, desperate finger directly at Maeve. "Look at her! She is nothing, a nameless, defective floor scrubber. She possesses no pure-blood lineage, no wealth, no army. How can she possibly rule Thornmere?" "I was trying to save you from a catastrophic, humiliating mistake, Arthur. I was trying to preserve the strength of the crown." Maeve did not shrink back from the venomous outburst. For 19 years she had survived by making herself incredibly small, bowing her head and absorbing the cruel, unwarranted hatred of the elite. But as the warm, golden luminescence of the solar seal thrummed powerfully against her skin, she finally realized she no longer needed to hide. The dormant celestial magic flowing through her veins was not a defect. It was a supreme, absolute sovereignty that eclipsed the petty, blood-soaked politics of the court. She looked down at the hysterical, weeping Duchess with an expression of profound, quiet pity. "True strength does not require poison in the dark, Duchess Giselle." Maeve spoke for the very first time before the assembled court. Her voice was soft, melodic, but it carried an undeniable, resonant clarity that effortlessly commanded the massive room. The celestial warmth of her sun-born bloodline leaked into the ambient air, completely neutralizing the bitter, toxic hatred radiating from the fallen noblewoman. You did not act for the realm. You acted for your own greed, and in doing so, you have broken the most sacred law of the pack. Arthur stepped slightly forward, his massive frame shielding his mate from the desperate, thrashing woman below. "Giselle Vance," the Alpha King pronounced, his tone dropping to a heavy, finalizing rumble that vibrated deep within the ancient obsidian stones of the floor. "For the cowardly crime of high treason, for the attempted assassination of the sovereign Queen of Thornmere, and for deliberately threatening the absolute sanctity of the fated mate bond, you are hereby stripped of all royal titles, lands, and pure-blood privileges." The condemned Duchess collapsed heavily to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably as the devastating sentence destroyed her entire identity in a single breath. "You will not be granted the swift mercy of the executioner's blade," Arthur continued relentlessly, his golden eyes devoid of any lingering pity. "You are sentenced to permanent, irrevocable exile in the deep salt mines of the absolute north. You will spend the rest of your miserable, agonizing life in the freezing dark, entirely forgotten by the world you tried to rule. Take her away." 4 heavily armored royal guards instantly stepped forward, grasping the screaming, thrashing noblewoman by her arms and forcefully dragging her backward through the cavernous hall. Her desperate, hysterical pleas echoed wildly against the vaulted ceilings, fading slowly into a pathetic, hollow silence as the heavy iron doors slammed shut behind her. The ultimate poetic justice had been served. The arrogant matriarch, who had built her empire on stepping over the weak, was now permanently condemned to the lowest, most grueling existence imaginable, and she would never, ever return. The remaining lords immediately dropped to their knees, pressing their foreheads firmly against the freezing marble floor in unquestioning submission to their king and his chosen mate. The toxic, manipulative hierarchy of the royal court had been shattered, replaced by the undeniable, terrifying devotion of a sovereign who would gladly burn the world to protect the woman standing beside him. Arthur slowly turned his attention back to Maeve. The feral, predatory edge completely vanished from his features, replaced by that staggering, profoundly vulnerable gentleness that he reserved exclusively for her. He lifted his bare, scarred hand, gently tracing the soft curve of her cheek. The physical contact sent a rush of pure, liquid warmth cascading down her spine, entirely erasing the lingering traumatic memories of the lye soap and the freezing winter slush. "It is done," he murmured, his deep voice thick with profound relief. "They will never threaten you again, Maeve. The shadows of this palace are finally cleared." "They are," she whispered back, leaning into the rough, collused warmth of his palm. The fated bond pulsed happily between them, a radiant, burning star completely free of the toxic clouds that had obscured it. The heavy, dramatic tension in the throne room slowly dissolved, making way for a shifting momentum that the kingdom had not felt in centuries. The darkness of the ancestral keep was about to face the dawn. 3 weeks later, the physical and emotional landscape of Thornmere had undergone a miraculous, impossible transformation. The biting, perpetual winter storms that had battered the high peaks of the Great Divide for over a century finally broke, giving way to the brilliant, vibrant warmth of an early, unexpected spring. The thick, suffocating layers of frost clinging to the obsidian walls of the palace melted entirely into rushing, musical streams of clear water, washing away the ancient, oppressive gloom. The grand courtyard of the royal keep was bathed in blinding, glorious sunlight. Thousands of citizens, pack members, and humbled nobles gathered in the expansive gardens, their faces lifted toward the massive stone balcony overlooking the vibrant, blooming landscape. The scent of fresh pine, damp earth, and blooming wild gardenias filled the air, completely replacing the heavy, metallic stench of war and political fear that had defined Arthur's reign. It was the day of the grand coronation, the highly anticipated moment when the newly bound queen would formally accept the crown. Maeve stood just inside the heavy velvet curtains of the balcony, her heart beating a rapid, nervous rhythm against her ribs. She was dressed in an intricate, breathtaking gown of spun gold and shimmering white silk, heavily embroidered with the ancient celestial suns of her newly discovered lineage. The heavy, ornate silver crown of the Luna rested securely atop her dark hair, a physical manifestation of the unbelievable status reversal she had experienced. She was no longer the invisible, defective servant forced to scrub the floors in agonizing silence. She was the absolute heart of the kingdom. Eldra Finch stood quietly beside her, her lined face beaming with immense, tearful pride. The aging head maid carefully adjusted the long, sweeping train of the royal gown, her rough hands lingering affectionately on the delicate silk. "You are ready, my queen," Eldra whispered, her voice thick with raw maternal emotion. "You have survived the lowest, darkest depths of this world. Now it is time to show them the light." Maeve smiled, her bandaged fingers finally healed, leaving only smooth, soft skin that no longer ached with the sting of chemical cleaners. She nodded gratefully to her mentor, taking a deep, fortifying breath as she stepped out from behind the velvet curtains and into the brilliant, roaring sunlight. The sudden, deafening roar of the gathered crowd echoed like rolling thunder across the valley. The sheer, overwhelming wave of absolute validation and joyous acceptance washed over her, silencing the lingering, insecure ghosts of her traumatic past. Waiting for her at the center of the massive stone balcony was Arthur. The Alpha King looked magnificent, dressed in a formal midnight blue tunic, trimmed in silver, completely devoid of the heavy, suffocating armor he usually wore to project untouchable dominance. But the most beautiful, liberating detail of his appearance was his hands. They were wonderfully bare. The dreaded gilded gloves, the heavy leather prisons that had kept him entirely isolated from the warmth of the world, had been permanently burned in the hearth fire of their private chambers. He stood tall, relaxed, and incredibly at peace, his steel-colored eyes soft, entirely devoid of the frantic, chaotic panic that had haunted him for a year. His gaze locked onto Maeve with an expression of such pure, unconditional devotion that it made her breath catch perfectly in her throat. As Maeve closed the distance between them, the ancient, dormant magic of the Sunborn bloodline finally achieved its full, magnificent awakening. The solar seal on her collarbone flared with a sudden blinding intensity, sending a massive, rippling shockwave of pure, molten golden light cascading outward from her fragile frame. The celestial magic swept over the balcony, washing over the stunned, silent crowd below. It was not a destructive, terrifying force like the Alpha Aura. It was a profound, healing warmth that physically settled into the aching bones of the kingdom's people, instantly curing old illnesses, soothing the lingering aches of the bitter winter and coaxing the dormant seeds in the royal gardens to burst into vibrant, sudden bloom. Priest Caspian Vane, standing at the edge of the balcony, dropped to his frail knees in weeping reverence as the golden light washed over his heavy grey robes. The ancient curse he had cast a year ago, the dark decree designed to shatter a mortal soul and punish a ruthless conqueror, had been flawlessly dismantled. In its place, the divine blessing of the Sunborn Queen had permanently anchored itself into the very bedrock of Thornmere. The kingdom would never suffer the devastating chill of isolation again. Arthur reached out, his bare, heavily scarred hands enveloping Maeve's small, soft fingers. The tactile, skin-to-skin contact was an immediate thrilling rush of fated resonance, a beautiful, harmonious blending of his protective, cedar-scented strength and her radiant, gardenia-sweet warmth. He pulled her close, wrapping his muscular arm securely around her waist, presenting her proudly to the weeping, cheering masses as his true equal. She was not standing behind him in the shadows, nor was she kneeling in submissive obedience. She was standing fiercely beside him, a sovereign ruler fully claiming her own undeniable power. Hours later, the loud, chaotic celebrations of the grand coronation had finally transitioned into a joyous, echoing melody drifting from the lower banquet halls. The high sun had finally set, giving way to a canvas of brilliant, twinkling stars scattered across the clear night sky. Maeve and Arthur escaped the overwhelming attention of the court, slipping quietly into the secluded, innermost sanctuary of the warm palace gardens. The ambient temperature was incredibly mild, entirely defying the usual freezing mountain climate thanks to the lingering protective aura of Maeve's awakened magic. The air smelled intoxicatingly of blooming night jasmine and rich, damp earth. They walked slowly down a winding cobblestone path, entirely alone in the quiet, peaceful dark. Arthur kept her hand securely tucked within his own, his thumb absent-mindedly tracing soothing, rhythmic circles against her knuckles. The fearsome Alpha King, the terrifying monster who had once reduced entire rival armies to ash, was currently displaying the gentle, relaxed contentment of a man who had finally found his permanent home. They stopped near a beautiful, bubbling marble fountain, the soft, musical trickling of the water providing a deeply soothing background to the quiet intimacy of the moment. Arthur turned to face her, his massive frame blocking out the cool night breeze. He lifted his free hand, gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. "I spent my entire life believing I was nothing but a weapon," Arthur murmured, his deep voice carrying a raw, emotional sincerity that resonated perfectly through the fated bond. "I believed the ancient priest was right to curse me, to lock me away behind heavy leather and absolute isolation. I thought my touch could only bring ruin." Maeve stepped closer, eliminating the physical distance between them. She reached up, resting her small, warm palms directly against the rough, scarred skin of his cheeks. The somatic feedback of the connection was a steady, burning thrum of pure, unconditional safety. The ancient warning no longer held any power over them, because the void had been filled. The absence was gone, replaced by a radiant, unshakable light. "You are not a weapon, Arthur," she whispered softly, her thumb gently tracing the edge of a faded battle scar near his jaw. "You are the man who caught me when I fell. You are the sovereign who wept for a broken servant. The curse did not ruin us. It simply guided us through the dark, ensuring we would collide at the exact moment we needed each other most." Arthur leaned heavily into her touch, letting out a long, shuddering sigh of profound relief. The sheer weight of his brutal past slipped entirely off his broad shoulders, washing away in the warm, healing current of her sun-born magic. He wrapped his powerful arms tightly around her waist, pulling her flush against his solid chest, burying his face in the soft, fragrant crook of her neck, right above the gently glowing solar seal. "Find someone who makes you want to build a better world," he murmured against her warm skin, the deep vibration of his voice settling deeply into her soul. "And I will spend every single day of my life proving that I am worthy of the light you brought into my dark palace." Maeve wrapped her arms securely around his broad, muscular back, completely enveloped in his protective embrace. The lingering ghosts of her traumatic isolation, the agonizing memories of the freezing floors, and the cruel, dismissive elite simply vanished into the night sky like insignificant smoke. She had accidentally stumbled into the most dangerous curse in the history of the realm, expecting to be shattered by a monster. Instead, she had found her true destiny, because being bound to the Alpha King had allowed her to be found by a better man, a better kingdom, a better life. And as the warm, golden light of the fated seal pulsed in perfect, eternal harmony with his heartbeat, Maeve Thorne knew she would never, ever look back.